But yeah, I thought that line was probably the most interesting because he'll open up that lecture saying, I have no knowledge or no interest, and then, pulls off the most interesting take out of the entire lecture about more or less all of East Asia in general. But yeah, he says it right there. Unquestionably, our relation to the peoples of the Far East has been colored by a certain sentimentality towards the Chinese. The sentimentality is disrespectful to them and is unhelpful to the long-term interests of our relations as the feelings of blind petulance into which now has a tendency to turn. Like, whew, in general, we expect too much from our Asian friends in a way of intimacy and mutual liking. There is something patronizing in this attitude of ours. We have never really thought through our full connotations of our domestic practices and habits to our thoughts and relations on the peoples of Asia.
Oh, that's a mouthful. I'm not really sure like what he means by sentimentalism. This is really interesting because I've never heard this phrase quite this way before, but it is true. And okay, this is why I'm not going to say he's misusing the word or he's lying or anything here, but there is something in, and this is a theme that runs all through. It's like a very small thing. You imagine like a little seam of gold. If you're looking for it, you can maybe find it with a lot of trying. But we don't really talk about it very much anymore. But America's obsession, I mean, and it is just a bona fide obsession with, and this is like, it's a meme phrase that appears as early as the 1830s, the late 1830s. It's the first time you hear this. Is this concept really actually no even earlier because Benjamin Franklin was low-key obsessed with China. Like he had like Confucian texts translated into English for the colonial audience that they didn't care at all. But like in the American like intelligentsia such as it exists, there's always been an obsession with this concept of the China trade. And this is definitely a holdover from sort of British influence. But as the first, America's attempted to open China a number of times this is why it was such a big deal in 1972 when Nixon finally seals the deal, because at that point that's over 100 years of repeatedly trying and failing to open the China trade. We first tried it in 1844 and made a little bit of headway and then sort of collapsed. And we do again in 1858. We try again in 1858 and get some concessions. We get the most favored nation status. We get the right, and this is coming off the heels because we do a lot of riding Britain's coattails in these days. But this is coming right off the first Opium War, and the when the British essentially neutralized China. Using hard drugs based, but we show up and kind of ride their coattails and we say we want that same deal. And because Britain is, and I return to this theme over and over and over again because it's so important, because Britain is involved in this larger political game than we are, like if you imagine America's geopolitical interests in the mid 19th century are like a game of checkers. The game the British are playing it's like a game of chess in which these smaller individual games of checkers are individual pieces. And the British are playing this thing called the Great Game with the Russians, and they're very interested in hedging their bets one way or the other. So sometimes they'll slap us on the wrist when we do something, and sometimes in this instance they're actually involved in a geopolitical dispute with us somewhere else over the Washington territory. It was a 54-40 or fight or whatever. At the same time, they're backing us up in China. It's just this weird way that British foreign policy tends to work.
Well, at the same time, right? Like to get the sentimentism or the sentimentality out of the way, like Kennan in Lecture 3 called "America and the Orient." That sentence about our relationship to the Far East is checkered by two key things that he feels is important to bring up. Contextually, right? These lectures are being given as the Korean War is opening up, and so our commentary with relationship to the Far East, he paints very similarly to the infamous memo by. John McMurray in 35, which had more or less called out what was going to play out in World War II, where, and at least in relationship to, say, our relationship to the Soviets and the Japanese. But, he quotes McMurray saying, like, the defeat of Japan would not mean her elimination from the problem of the Far East of virile people. They're not made tractable by defeat and national humiliation. They tend rather to reassert themselves with a passionate impulse of self-esteem, methods which may well give them a nuisance value, scarcely if least at all potent than force which was exerted in their prime as an imperial power. But even if the elimination of Japan, if it were possible, would be no blessing to the Far East or to the world, it would simply create a new set of stresses, a substitute for Japan, the USSR as the successor to Imperial Russia, as a contestant. As for the mastery of the East, no one except Russia would gain power from our victories in such a war. Even if we were to quote unquote save China from Japan, it is no reproach to the Chinese to acknowledge that we would have established no claim upon their gratitude. Nations and races collectively do not seem, in general, to be susceptible to that kind of sentiment. They would thank us for nothing and give us no credit for unselfish intentions, but set themselves formulating resistance to us in the exercise of responsibilities we would have assumed. Now that's in 1935, so like this is before really the rise that we really get to see of America getting more and more involved in the Sino Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek and the communists.
Well,
And this is
I'm not familiar with McMurray. Is he a Yale School guy?
McMurray was the former. I want to say he was like America's like Far East affairs after we reorganized the diplomatic corps in 1926. But he's definitely, I don't know if he's Yale or not. I'd have to look that up. I think he's Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah.
Oh no, Harvard. Eh. This is not their forte, but that was definitely a prescient take. You know, he sort of called exactly what was going to happen.
And I mean, that's even before, our, he was like one of the few China experts in there. Because he had coveted the China position, but his disagreements over the position over Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists would get him out there after he left foreign service. But I mean, he served in academia and all sorts of jazz. But I think he went to Cornell. He was not a Harvard.
Oh man, even worse. But the reason I ask is because the guy that I am most familiar with all of the open door stuff and really all of American Far East policy in this era is a guy by the name of A. Whitney Griswold, who was a actually, this is one of the only times I've ever gone to an archive. I went to the Harvard archive and I was attempting to track this guy's personal papers down. Oh, no, it was the Yale archive, excuse me. I was at the Yale archive and I was attempting to track this guy's personal papers down. And, for whatever reason, I've never been turned down in an archive before whenever I asked to see somebody's. Well, I mean, I've never gone and asked for Thomas Jefferson's like handwritten notes or anything like that. And that might be a little more controlling. But hey, Whitney Griswold's were locked down. I'm like, this guy was he's just an intellectual, but he wrote a book called, he actually wrote a number of very interesting articles, including one called Juncker's Hostages to the Past about, and this is in 1943. He wrote this one, and it was essentially an argument for why Germany has to be totally dismantled and their ancient, proud, aristocratic ruling class has to be, ground into bone dust. It's just fascinating.
Talk for a guy that was a descendant of Eli Whitney.
I was gonna say, yeah. You're looking at his wiki now. But yeah, he wrote a book called the Far East Policy of the United States, which is
cited in Kennan's lectures.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean, it's mammoth. It's like 600 pages, and it was at least up until the 1980s. It was the State Department's go-to text on Far Eastern affairs.
Yeah, it's literally cited on page 44 about America and the Orient. Like, this is the history. Yeah, page 135 is what he cites from there. I mean, it's a thick text.
That's the one. I mean, that's like it's the one. So this McMurray guy, I'm like, who the hell are you? Like I never heard of you, but he's like must be some competitor. There's some similarities in the takes. Now, what's interesting is that Kennan and Griswold have differing takes on the open door policy, and I'm not actually sure I totally agree with either of them. And I think part of the reason is because of this person, John Hayes, who is it Hayes or Hay? I get it wrong all the time.
There's John Hay. No,
yeah,
Hayes.
I knew it was a Hay. Yeah, there's Rutherford B. Hayes, and then there's John Hay. But this guy is, he's a bit of a luminescent figure, and there's a tendency, especially in American historiography, sometimes I think, around this time we start taking ourselves seriously, in a way that we hadn't before. And also, like, these guys, Griswold and Kennan, they're writing less than a full generation after, so they're really still, part of the same kind of era of like sort of American intellectual emergence. And sometimes they'll tend to overplay the sagacity of these characters. Okay, so John Hay is a guy, I'm not sure where he was from. I imagine he's probably from Connecticut, but I know he went to Brown, which is, again, I'm just dunking on all of the Ivy League schools today. But, I don't know anybody that went to Brown except for, like Curtis Yarvin went to Brown. But, Brown it's not the spiffiest of the Ivy League schools today. And in the time we're talking about, it was kind of like a community college, like even Harvard and Yale weren't the institutes of higher learning that we think of today. And so he's one of these New England characters, and he didn't go to Harvard. That's a red flag already.
He wasn't from New England. He's from Indiana.
Okay, so he's from Indiana, but anyway, he didn't go. Now that's fascinating. But he didn't go to Harvard. So he didn't go to Harvard or Yale. This is already immediately fascinating. So he's already, there's a tendency to believe he's kind of an underperformer. He's a very wily character. He's cunning. He's good at, and this.
I'm surprised you don't know more about him, considering he wrote one of the lengthiest contemporary, he co-authored it, but he knew more about. He was a part of, he was the Assistant Secretary of State. He worked with, Seward. He was there at Lincoln's deathbed. He wrote a biography.
Yeah, he was Lincoln's personal secretary. He's also a poet. He's a terrible poet, but he was a poet. He wrote one weird futurist novel that was, not as unusual for the time. But in general, he's very similar to. He's a member of this emergent ethnicity, really, that, I'm sort of, whatever notoriety I currently have is probably for talking about these people, but he's a member of this emergent WASP intelligentsia. When you ask this question, what is a WASP? John Hay is a WASP, okay? And so whenever we talk about WASPs, what we're really talking about, we're in, because there's generals, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and you use the term today, and you're gonna tend to catch a lot of people that wouldn't have initially been caught up in the acronym of WASP. So Scots-Irish would not normally have been, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians would not normally have been considered. WASPs are a kind of an emergent ethnicity that come out of the post-Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and it ends up being this kind of fusion of the old Southeastern, very coastal elite with the, Boston Brahmins, and they intermarry among one another, and they set about curating. It's a very stylized, very artificially created, group of people, and they use the Episcopalian Church as their, as their vetting mechanism. So they'll bring people from the lower castes into waspdom through intermarriage and patronage and this sort of thing, and they usually filter them in through the Episcopalian Church. But it's a very select group of people early on. They're very enamored of this idea that Harvard is going to be the American Athens and Yale is going to be the American Sparta. They're very enamored of William James and George Santayana, and they imagine themselves building this, and the word I'm going to use is utopian. They imagine themselves building this utopian state in the United States that's free of the old world's ills. And this is the sort of messianic context that Hay comes out of, okay? And he's a little bit younger than Henry Adams, but you're like, I'm surprised you don't know more about this guy. He's not a guy that I know just a whole lot about, but I know more than the average person does. And my exposure to him is mostly through one of the most esoteric Americans to ever live, Henry Adams. So there's during the Roosevelt administration, Hay is actually one of Henry Adams's closest confidants. I'm sure I've talked about Henry Adams when I've been on here before. Henry Adams is very, he's the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the great grandson of John Adams. He's this very quixotic character who is like, he is actually very refined, very European in sensibilities and so on and so forth. And he kind of allows this character, Hay, to enter his orbit, knowing also that Hay is Roosevelt's man. Okay, Hay is a Roosevelt man, and Henry Adams and Theodore Roosevelt don't really like each other. But at the time, Henry Adams is living in a house across Lafayette Square from the White House. He calls it the anti-White House, or the dark White House, or something like that. Okay, so he kind of hosts.
How parliamentary of him.
Yeah. He kind of hosts this alternate anti-U.S. government, bohemian sort of, intelligentsia from, outside the inner party across Lafayette Square from the actual White House. And Hay is one of the characters that, he's involved in the Roosevelt administration, but he's also he sifts back and forth, and he slides into both worlds and kind of comes out with quite a bit of influence from both. But there is a thing that's going on in the in the 1890s. I don't know if we want to talk about this now, the geopolitical context here.
Well, actually, that's what I was going to get into, since we've spent the last 15 minutes covering personalities and intrigue of the American upper class.
It's so important for this story, though. I mean, it really is. It's so important for this story because it's important to recognize that this is at a time when the American State Department, the whole State Department, is about 24 people. Okay. And I've described this before. I've described this world before as it's an era in American government when your alma mater matters considerably more than what your political party affiliation is. Okay. And what families you're connected to and what families you're married into. These matter a lot more than what your political party affiliation is. Because I mean, one of the things we're going to learn here about the open doors notes is that they're not actually, there's no binding, there's no way to bind this policy to reality when these notes start coming out.
No, it all kind of coincidentally comes down to the fact that the boxers were getting antsy and ready to take action.
Right. But what lends these notes their authority is that there is something like a consent, an internal elite group consensus amongst these WASPs, and they have kind of a gentleman's agreement to sort of abide by it. Whereas normally today, if we're going to do something like open door, if we're going to do this massive shift in, American trade policy, Congress is at least going to get to say something about it. And this is also an era whenever Congress is incredibly unruly. This is the 95th and 96th Congresses, which were largely elected on the basis of domestic issues. I wrote about this quite a bit in grad school, is that this is a very unusual Congress to have deal with as many foreign policy issues as eventually get shoved on its plate, because the 1896 election was the Great Silver election. Okay, so it's William Jennings Bryan, and Jennings Bryan loses his election, but quite a few populist and silver Democrats are elected to Congress, and they're an exceptionally unruly lot. They're less educated. than the average American was in a lot of cases. This is literally the deplorable, the deplorable Congress, and so the executive branch is going to really undercut them and go around them as often as they can, because like even doing very simple procedural votes, like the debates around formally annexing Hawaii rather than holding it as this kind of weird, liminal area where it's like Americans have like filibustered Hawaii, but they don't have any protection from the U.S. government, and Germany is becoming a problem. It's very difficult even to get this formal annexation passed, because there's a large anti-imperialist element, there's a large racial element, there's a large element that wants to use foreign policy issues to push roll their rock up the hill about the silver issue. So the executive branch is going to really start looking. They're going to do their best to circumvent Congress everywhere they can. And these open doors notes are really an example of it, of kind of early progressive executive branch acting pretty unilaterally. And then what we find out is the open doors notes don't really have any binding authority to them until Great Britain endorses them, and then they become a thing. But yeah, let's talk about the geopolitics real quick, because this is important. Why the British are so interested here, okay, and why they take this character John Hay and they kind of pump him up, and they do this thing. They're doing this thing where Hay is in Britain. Well, Britain's colonial secretary at the time. Is a man by the name of Joseph Chamberlain, and he's got this very expansive idea of what the British Empire should look like. He thinks it's not centralized enough, it's not formalized enough, and he thinks it's in trouble. And we're going to look at why he thinks it's in trouble here in a second. And he looks at the United States, and he sees in the United States a potential bulwark against the demise of the British Empire. And so
and this is a good way to sort of also bring in Kennan's lectures on the open door policy. So he says, there's no evidence that the British Foreign Office attached much importance to this approach or had much hope for its success. The British diplomatic corps were more interested in other overtures that they were making at the same time to Japan and Germany. The approach to us had apparently been pressed upon by their colonial minister, Mr. Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain, who had an American wife, who had high hopes for an Anglo-American political cooperation. He is powerful in domestic politics and took a prominent part in the conduct of foreign policy. Kennan says, I suspect that he had been needling the Foreign Office about enlisting American cooperation in China, and that the Foreign Office had sent a note to our government largely to satisfy him, perhaps even to demonstrate that there was nothing in the idea, but that is only a conjecture. Whereas really there is a significant bit of interest for the English, or the Anglo government really, I should say, or just the British government, to have a greater American cooperation as we begin to sort of rise. We sort of have this war with Spain that happens like almost, really this is all in the coattails of it all. And what would
it's all the same issue. It's all like there's no way to extricate them. Okay, and we'll get to that in a second.
Well, yeah, no, I'm getting to it. I'm getting to it. Yeah. My point is that you have three simultaneous things happening at once. They're more or less one after another, but they're more or less the same sort of event. You have the Spanish-American War, which then fundamentally puts the United States in a position far closer to China than it had ever been before, which now has it keenly interested in within like the Chinese market, which is already built upon a non-existent Oriental policy at the time. You're having what will soon be the outbreak of like the Filipino rebellion against the United States, the Battle for Manila Bay, which really sours the American political electorate. And this is all before your big William Jennings Bryan election, the silver election, where all these sort of like deplorables, quote unquote, get into Congress.
Yeah, and you 1895 is the big year. 1895 is the most important year. So this is prior to the Jennings Bryan election. Yeah,
but all of that is built on this domestic focus. And then you have this war which ravages the internal American political opinion of the country, but not just them, but also its intelligentsia. And you have sort of this more market-oriented, mercantilist, like waspy class that recognizes that there is a need to rely on the British Empire, as we've been riding on their coattails now since more or less Reconstruction. Even further than that. But I mean, like, finally, this big sense of like good feelings between Great Britain and the United States is in full swing. Finally, on top of this, you also have the open door policy, which has been like a growing concern because the British As Kennan notes, this had been an oft-repeated doctrine, that old phrase quoted ad nauseum, and this is noted in British parliamentarian notes in the 1890s. But Kennan's also quick to point out that on top of this, you also have the Filipino Rebellion, which happens in 1899, which immediately sours a lot of like America's like political will to do so. So you have this Congress that really wants to focus only on explicitly domestic issues, and so we're witnessing through marriage, education, political classes, and as we know with John Hay, political patronage, who spent quite a bit of money and was paid quite a bit of money to campaign for McKinley in 1896. That we have all these guys perfectly aligned in government to start reaching out through letters and connections to start implementing a more modern open door, not just for like China, but more of America putting an open door to engage with the rest of the world in regards to foreign policy. And Kennan is quick to know that this relationship with Chamberlain is built, or Chamberlain's relationship to Hay is built out of the fact that Hay's once the former ambassador to London before he's appointed Secretary of State, because John Sherman's an old senile. He's like Biden in a lot of ways. But at the same time, right, you also got the UK asking about the US in regards to like the open door policy, and their concern was to the British government had sent out that message in part because they're greatly concerned about what Russia and Germany are doing. And I think that's maybe a good time to bring in that first graphic that you had made.
Yeah. Now we have to do a little context here, because we're in a lot of ways we're building a bridge between the last time we did one of these streams, which was about the Monroe Doctrine,
Yes.
and this one. In fact, had we gone on longer with the Monroe Doctrine stream, this was the stuff that I was going to have to start talking about. Okay, now get my map up there. Okay, now so what we can see going on here, just to give you a real quick rundown of how I have labeled this. Market size, people ask me, what market do you mean? Okay, what I've done here is I've added the total exports and the total imports. So this is total number, total value of goods changing hands in ports owned by these entities. I'm actually not sure if the UK figure includes India. Which does make quite a bit of a difference, but you can definitely see what's going on here. So we start in 1850, and this is, early industrial revolution. And we can, you can sort of see things start to, you can see the great acceleration occurring. But what we've done here is we've taken, and I've added, I put China in here. So you can see partially really what a non-player China actually is in this whole open door thing. Nobody's really asking China what they think about anything at this point. China is a castrated empire at this point. They're coming off their third or fourth civil war in the last 100 years. One of them is this Taiping Rebellion. Is that the name of it?
Yes.
It killed like a third of the country. And they're also like, they've got this little boy, not quite maybe yet, but they've got this very weak imperial family. They're an emperor whose grandmother is constantly attempting to orchestrate all these palace coups. It's a very weak country at this point. And we can see also, they're not exporting a lot. They're not importing a lot. This is one of these things that makes this China trade meme kind of jokey, because America is very interested in this China trade, but there's not very much of it. Okay, so really, all of this wrangling around China, especially on the part of Americans, they're just perceiving that such a large mass of humanity must be a great market for American goods. Okay, there's not really a lot of receipts to back this up at this point. Okay, they're really kind of just flying on a whim. But if we look at what happens here now, I've also included some of the other old world empires. I included France and the Netherlands. Really, I only included those so you could see just how quickly the UK, Germany, the United States are accelerating away from them. Okay, so like this is like a horse race where the massed pack at the beginning of the horse race is really starting to separate. There's two separate horse races going on. There's the ones that are vying for the winner, and then there's the ones that are trying to not be last. Okay, and that's kind of where France and the Netherlands, they kind of fall into this category. But if we look at Germany, and what I've done here also, the box shadings, the lighter shading that's from the point that Germany is unified. Okay, so at the start of this graph, Germany is the North German Confederation, and I think the South German Confederation, this collection of Catholic city-states and this sort of thing. And what's going on here is Germany is unified, and that's almost the point at which you can start to see their lines. Their line starts to go straight up at that point. The UK is, and then the darker shading is this is from the time when the open door policy is in play, and the Anglo-American alliance has been more or less established. Okay, and we can you start to see how this plays out. But this map, this graph, all it really does is kind of show, and then of course Russia is down here. Russia is down here because if you'll remember, I like to talk about this all the time, how the British Empire, Anglo-American Empire, and the Russian Empire, the only two that have ever really mattered in the last 300 years. It's interesting to see how far behind Russia actually is in international trade here, even all the way up to the beginning of World War I, and Russia is still punching massively above its weight. Okay, so this is, if you want to see what a reason why these other countries are so concerned about Russia and why the United States today is so concerned about Russia, is because even an economically castrated Russia can punch way above its weight in the real world. Okay. Did you have anything to say about that? Sorry, that was a lot of talking.
No, you're good. I usually have a pretty good idea of when you're done there, Sandbatch. But the thing that also you need to keep in mind when we take a look at China's wrecked primarily by the Taiping Rebellion, which I'm glad that you had brought up. I highly recommend. This is my favorite book on the subject that I've read so far. It's called Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, China, the West, and the Epic Story of the Taiping Civil War by Stephen Platt. And you can get this for like $15. It's a really well worth your time. But he's talking about mainly how, how the West is viewing this entire conflict. Because right now in the midst of this, you're having the American Civil War play out for the latter, third of this conflict. Because it goes from like 1850 to 1864. And, if you want to talk about the millions must die meme, I mean, this would be the place to do it. Total deaths about conservative estimates like 25 million people.
Yeah, and
that's inside China.
It's like steampunk death too. Not like Zyklon B or anything like that. There's no industrial killing here. That's it's like people getting stabbed with pitchforks and shit. This is brutal. Don't even think about it.
This is not one of those like fun times that you want to be a part of. But I mean, this is in regards to just the relationship overall with respect to the West. Is that you have the difficulty that the Qing dynasty was really adamant to enforce the treaties of Wester Ashburton Treaty. Like they were adamant to respect this to bypass any issues of slavery. They were also very adamant that we're going to try and keep a very openly defined boundary there as well. They're also going to abide by the first Treaty of Nanking or the first Opium War, which gets called unequal treaties as well. What's left of the Qing dynasty is just not playing around with any more governments.
Right.
But at the same time,
it's a rump state. There's no we should have had a map of it too, where you can see what the Qing dynasty is at this point is, and I think really by the time we get to 1895, this is the year that I'm going to circle back on over and over again. All of their important port cities have been taken via by hook or crook. Germany has just careened into Tsingtao. And what is that? What is Sapporo also? They're Germany is the last country to enter the colonial race, and they're picking up the scrap. Germany and America are both kind of picking up scraps in this colonial race. But at this point in time, China has been carved up into like lots of little spheres of influence is what all of this is, what all of this is over. So like, when you talk about the open door policy in China, really in a lot of ways, what you're talking about, the United States does this is the same play that we run over and over again. And we've learned this from the British. I mean, you can see us playing this card right now in Ukraine. One of our favorite thing to do is intervene in the internal affairs of another country by framing ourselves. And we tried to do this with the Monroe Doctrine. Like if you remember the Monroe Doctrine story, James Monroe wanted to go to war with Europe on behalf of Hungary, of all places, and we're doing this thing again. We're like, oh, well, now, the Chinese people have a right to self-determination, and, the United States, as the world's guardian of democracy, stands with the Chinese people. And, and we obviously have our own, agenda. We want the China trade. We want, we want to limit the other European powers expansion, particularly in our case, Germany. But our enabler is not actually all that concerned about Germany at this point in time. They're more worried about Russia, And yeah, let's go to the next graph and let's look at why they're so concerned about Russia. And you'd be able to see it. In 1895, it's important to realize there's a great passage in Barbara Tuchman's book, The Proud Tower, where she says, though, the last government in the Western world, maintaining the, all of the mechanisms of aristocracy in place was Lord Salisbury's government, when the Conservatives took power in 1895. And this is truly the height of the British Empire. Like whenever you think about the British Empire map, this is the one with all the red splotches on it. It's, it covers around 22 million square kilometers, which is, it's bigger than Russia in terms of land area. But one of the things that it's done for the last 60 years, really since the Napoleonic Wars, it did get involved in the Crimean War against Russia. Okay. But one of the things that it's done is pursued this policy that it refers to as splendid isolation. Okay. And now call your attention to this point in 1880. If you look on the map right at 1880, now this map, this graph is a little different. So what I've done here is I've left the UK by itself so we can see how the UK by itself is performing. Okay. And then I've outlined, and this is rote economic modeling, but it ends up being a pretty good heuristic for this particular decade. Like the total amount of trade that a country is doing is a pretty good indicator of its total strength, because this is the emergence of capitalism, second industrial revolution, all that fun stuff. China, again, I left them on here down just as a baseline to measure. China down here at the bottom. But in, what we have here is these are scenarios that have kind of been gamed out, because in 1895, in 1880, the actuarial geniuses in Great Britain have, they realize something uncomfortable about themselves, which is that if Russia and Germany somehow manage to get their act together, and remember, the Tsar of Russia I think it was Alexander at the time, he's just married his kid into the Germano-Anglic royal family, and all three of these countries are going to be attached to the hip for the next generation at least. Tsar Nicholas II, or Tsar Nicholas II is and Wilhelm II and George, which was George V. I think it was George V. Yeah, George V. They're all first cousins. Okay. But if you look at what's going on here in 1880, or around 1880, this line that corresponds to the total size of the market between Russia and Germany crosses over the United Kingdom by itself. And that, it's easy to think that, okay, we've got Data Wrapper and Microsoft Excel and all these things like that. We can see things that they couldn't see. Remember, these people were eldritch Anglo wizards. They knew exactly what was happening, and they were starting to get a little concerned about it. In 1895, they have another issue, which is that they nearly go to war in Egypt with France. Okay. And at the same time they nearly go to war with France, they're facing a number of international crises. One with the United States in Venezuela. They're facing an international crisis in China again. They're always very concerned about their eastern ports because that's their breadbasket. And so they're starting to.
I'm gonna interrupt you there though, because I think it's just gonna highlight some important aspects that play a role in like American foreign policy even to this day. Like Kennan's talking about this in 1950, mind you, but this is held up over a century later. But the first thing we need to talk about is sort of the Russia punching above its weight thing again, because you want to talk about the breadwinners of Eastern ports. Like Britain's got the subcontinent at the time, but Kennan points out the key issue with regards to sort of like Anglo diplomatic neuroticism, and I'm going to just read off from Kennan here. Now, at the end of 1897 and the beginning of 1898, there was a real and justifiable fear that China would be partitioned. It was in those months that the Russians had made evident their determination to have a special position in Manchuria, including a naval base at Port Arthur and a commercial port at the present Darien, both which had connected a railway from the Trans-Siberian, that the Germans had consolidated their control over the port of Kiakau and their influence in the Shantung Peninsula, and that the French, coming up from the south from the present Indochina, successfully negotiated with the Chinese government for the lease of a port, for railroad concessions, and for the appointment of a French citizen as the head of Chinese postal services, among other political favors. These happenings naturally caused a particular concern for London, because up to that time, the British had been overwhelmingly the masters of Chinese trade. They had 80% of it, and with all of the other countries put together, including the United States, had 20%. So they had like this inverse Pareto advantage in regards to trade, access to government, that the British played a quintessential role in respects to, getting the Taiping fighters to not attack certain cities at the behest of the Qing dynasty during the Boxer Rebellion. All these things that are playing in the foreground to our context for today. And so they had been always advocating for an open door policy with China, but it had become increasingly a reality to them that these sort of alliances that we're talking about, either in trades of values and markets, access to them, that, if Russia and Germany are going to do well together, either both, let's say, in the East, or more specifically, increased Germanic trade out of Africa alongside from German-Prussian borders to Russia, like the British are obviously concerned. And this is where, this is the one time where we're finally beginning to see after 3 decades of America sort of riding British coattails, where they're finally beginning to look at the United States and realizing that we can use them for our own ends.
Right. Well, I mean, so if you look at this line again as well, they also realize that the United States is lagging behind Germany and the UK in industrialization. It is, but it's catching up quickly. And again, Joseph Chamberlains of the world, they realize that when this line crosses, it ain't crossing back ever again. Okay, so they do know the score, and so and to go back to Russia and Germany for a second, they've begun really starting to cooperate with one another more than they have in the past, and they're unifying themselves around this weird concept. We saw it in the past, actually. We saw it again with the Monroe Doctrine episode. This concept of the monarchical principle. Okay, they're really starting to form this kind of block again, where they get together and they decide that, especially in the case of America, they're a little bit more leery about the UK, because the UK still has, particularly a naval advantage where they can crush in mano a mano. The British Empire can crush anybody in the all through the late 19th century, all through the early 20th century. There's not really any competition, but combinations start to challenge them a little bit. And so they've gamed out in 1895, they've gamed out a couple of scenarios because they've decided they need an ally, and the first place they need an ally is in Asia, and so they go snag Japan. Okay, and that was an easy one. It did send shockwaves through the Orient that the British are formally allied with Japan. That's not all that. It's kind of important for what we're talking about. It's not terribly important. The one that's important is they've looked at this situation and they've decided that they need a European ally too. They need a Western ally, maybe not a European ally. They need a Western ally. So they look at what's on the table. France is a shit show. They have just almost gone to war with France. France is, during the course of this, of these events, they descend into national chaos during the Dreyfus Affair. They have like 5 governments that fall in 1 year. France is in such bad shape. Germany is out. Germany has just kind of pushed their shit in 1870. They have a declining population. They're very concerned about the total fertility rate. Germans are breeding much quicker than them. And the whole atmosphere around France is this sort of decadent. It's formally decadent. And there's this phrase that goes around, la fin du monde latin. They're calling it the end of the Latin world. So France is kind of off the table for the British at this point. Now, it's interesting because we know, in 10 years, this situation is going to reverse. And France is going to be the ally, and the British and Russia are going to get together. But that's not on the table here yet. So whenever they decide they need a European ally or they need a Western ally, they settle on these 2 countries, the United States and Germany. And so I've put these two, I've put these situations, put these scenarios. This is what they're looking at. So they're looking at what happens if Germany and the UK get together. Look at what their total market looks like. And if Germany and the UK and the US get together, look what their total market looks like. They're pretty similar lines. Like, lines look very same, Okay, so they've determined that an alliance with either of these countries will give them the overwhelming advantage they need to continue persisting as the world hegemon. Okay, and they set about deciding which one they're going to do. Okay. And one of the things that makes this is where the Great Rapprochement is kind of interesting. They really wanted Germany. Like, they initially made a lot of overtures towards Germany. Okay. Germany is run by this character, Wilhelm II, he's an Anglophile. He loves the English, but he acts like a loon. Okay, he's got a terrible tendency to like loonish behavior, aggressive behavior, bellicose behavior. They ultimately decide that he can't really be trusted, and so they turn and they look at America and they take stock of the situation in America, and what they see is a country that is growing incredibly rapidly, and in fact has gotten a little bit too big for its britches. It's run by these WASP characters who have adopted a faux British accent. If you listen to recordings of these people, this is where that mid-Atlantic accent comes from. They start pronouncing their words with a British affectation. They're starting these Anglo-Saxon clubs and celebrating their story right at the same time. Frederick Jackson Turner is in historiography. Woodrow Wilson and Frederick Jackson Turner are writing, the Teutonic seed theory, where the essentially Darwinistic conceptions of, race are starting to take hold, and everybody can more or less agree that, us and the English, we're the same guys, aren't we? We're going to be on the same team now, aren't we? And so the British see in the United States kind of a rube, okay? And this character, John Hay, and this other character, Teddy Roosevelt, in a lot of ways, step right in the poop. Okay. And, they abandon what has, more like from most of the 19th century, the British are the primary antagonist of we've gone to war with these people twice in the last 100 years. They did everything they possibly could to stoke, an American Civil War into happening, and they got what they wanted. That's a whole other stream. But the British have not been friendly, and the Germans have been friendly. So there's this question: why would America not be more friendly to Germany? And what sort of happens here is that this character John Hay and this kind of fledgling WASP group at State Department, they kind of get played a little bit, and I don't mean played in the sense that they didn't, they get suckered into doing something that's not to their advantage, because it definitely was to their advantage. But the idea of like widespread rapprochement between the elite class of Great Britain and the Great Britain and the United States is probably overblown. Okay, so like, the like Julian Pauncefote and like Lord Salisbury, they still think of these Americans as kind of rubish, but when the Spanish they decide they need to they're going to need America to help, and so what they do is they throw in the towel in Venezuela, because whatever, so we'll throw the Americans a bone in Venezuela. And then when the United States pretty much unilaterally, Teddy Roosevelt pretty much unilaterally decides we need a war with Spain, he starts it. And one of the little known aspects of the Spanish-American War is that Germany headed a coalition. Well, Germany established a coalition headed by, of all people, the Pope, okay, to intervene in the Spanish-American War on behalf of, quote, the monarchical principle, okay? And Germany has built a pretty sizable coalition of countries that are, largely unbeknownst to America, are actually threatening to intervene in the Spanish-American War. And one of the things you don't hear about the Battle of Manila Bay is that the great triumph of Admiral Dewey at the Battle of Manila Bay was not unobserved. There were two other fleets there. Not two other fleets in the area. There were two other fleets present. So like what you kind of have is a storm in a teacup, where the American fleet is duking it out with the Spanish fleet and totally destroys them.
They didn't even have enough ammunition. I mean, as I said in the previous episode, that the Americans began opening fire, and the Spanish fleet at the time, which is not aware at all of American declaration of hostilities, because communication at that time is slow. And so by the time that the King of Spain reads the American statement on what they're going to do as an act of war, the Spanish naval fleet in the Philippines, particularly in Manila Bay, has no idea. And when the Americans open fire, that they simply they flag the Americans back, saying we don't have enough ammunition for this like wonderful celebration entrance thing that you guys are doing. But
right.
The war breaks off. But I to get us maybe back on track, because I feel like we've just thrown a shit ton of names, people, and histories of wonderful Sandbatch historiography.
Sorry.
It happens. That's why this is pre-recorded. If they don't want to listen, they can do that elsewhere. But this is an era though where you have sort of like shadowy, we're going to go behind the back of the people, bureaucracies are going to do what they want. And it's not so much really that we'd have, and maybe to put some things into context, for instance, right? A lot of what Sandbatch has outlined is an illustration that the Americans are sort of walking into kind of at behest of a few specific individuals. Primarily, as Kennan points out, you've got the probably one of the most important individuals that will come into this is going to be two gentlemen that Kennan will cite in lecture number 2 about the open door. And literally the open door lecture is called Mr. Hippisley and the Open Door. But the two primary Englishmen that we're going to hear from are Sir Robert Hart and then our dear friend, Mr. Hippisley, who, like we had mentioned earlier, this is all part of the fact that Joseph Chamberlain has an American wife. It envisions this sort of Anglo-American alliance. And this is in the backdrop of all the things that we've discussed here, the rising amounts of economies, Germany's sort of lateness to colonial endeavors. We can see this primarily in the scramble for Africa. You get like Togo and Benin and a few other places. But also at the same time, you've got the first Sino-Japanese War, which took place and ended in 1895 with the Qing government suing for peace. But the three nations that intervene in regards to Japan are Russia, Germany, and France. And the response to that triple intervention, of course, is like the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And that leads down to a whole other major play in the future. But all these things illustrate that there is this old war battle for, again, a scramble for China, more or less, in the midst of 2 opium wars. Well, really, the first one had already played out. In the midst of the Taiping Rebellion, the large amount of encroachment from France, Germany, and primarily Russia, which had over like 4,000 miles of bordering territory with the Chinese, despite the fact that England had 80% of all trade. And all of a sudden, the United States, sort of in the midst of these characters, Chamberlain, Hart, Hippisley, are working with the already existing, because John Hay, before he becomes Secretary of State, is the United States ambassador to Great Britain. And you have relationships where he brings in one other gentleman. This will hopefully be one of the last few names that we bring up in today's stream. But he brings in the American minister, or he brings in the minister to Greece, which is W.W. Rockhill. And Rockhill, of course, has a great relationship with Hippisley and others, who is primarily the head of the Chinese customs service for the English. And he's trying to make sure that like America can kind of begin to step in for this open door policy. So rather than seeing a partitioning of an already weakened Chinese state that has been racked by a war with Japan, a war with drugs, a war that has killed 25 to 35 million of its own people in a syncretic Protestant, civil war over religion and government. The British are finally realizing that the Americans can actually do something here, even though they don't really have primarily authority. So if you're wondering just what the hell the open door policy is, it is John Hay stating, with no real authority to state it, because he had gotten, one, no real consensus from the Congress. He was primarily dealing with the fact that he had to act quickly and privately, saying that the Senate was not something they wanted to deal with. But they had spent like about a year or so pressing like the Russian government, like, hey, we want to have an open door policy. And the Tsar's government's not giving them anything. In fact, St. Petersburg didn't want to answer the Americans at all and give a very cryptic response. And so, John Hay just goes out and says to everybody, actually, we have the support of all the major world powers, France, Germany, Russia, and Great Britain, that China is going to stay territorially, territorially, its territorial integrity is going to stay the same. There's no carving up of China like we've done with Africa.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that's sort of interesting here is that there's a commentary to be made. What is the British advantage here, and what is the American advantage? The Americans, they actually might be. Kennan thinks that he's a little cynical about America. I think that there is, there really is quite a bit of genuine feeling. He calls it sentimentalism, I guess, but there really quite is, a genuine feeling that the Chinese people do deserve, some sort of self-determination.
Well, how do you sell it, though? This is the thing, right? We just talked about the last hour or so. We talked about the old world geopolitical play, but we also had to talk about the domestic aspect in the United States. And Kennan talks about this as well, because you have to understand what's happening with this open door principle is, again, this all ties into the Boxer Rebellion. But what's happening at the same time, like, in the back door of all this is that, again, is the American understanding of what the word imperialism means. And I'm just, as a teaser for the audience, I'm working on an essay on the definition of that and trying to talk about this BS interpretation from the British that has sort of influenced all sorts of Marxist thought. But we'll get there. We'll get to that later. We're going to talk about J.A. Hobson for another day, guys. But, what's the discussion? It's just that in the midst of all this back and forth between the British and the Russians and the issue over China, is that both parties are debating the term imperialism. So, while there's this discussion over what Hay needs to do, and what do we have immediately? Well, what do we have to worry about? Well, we have 1900 to worry about, the election. And so you have the Republican National Convention met in Philadelphia on June 19th. The Democratic Convention met in Kansas City on July 4th. And, at the same time, all of the bits of the Boxer Rebellion is beginning to kick off more or less around the same time. And Hay is like desperate to focus the issue back into international affairs. And this is really where America finally begins to do it. He finally sends out the circular July 3rd, 1900. And he specifically states that it is the policy of the government of the United States to seek and to preserve Chinese territorial administrative entity, in reference, of course, to the Chinese government at the time, which of course is the imperial government, and pushing.
What is the primary way to sell this to the American electorate?
Well, the way you sell that to the American electorate, and the way that you do it, is that you campaign that America is this like force for anti-imperial good to the old world.
Another one. Yeah, there's another much more immediate, more visceral one. Like, how do you sell this in the southern states? How do you sell this in the western states? How do you sell this in California?
Racism.
we say we have to stabilize China to prevent, the yellow horde from coming here. This is an era when Chinese immigration was a huge scare. You know, several states have passed legislation barring the Chinese. That's the only time in American history we have ever specifically barred a single country from immigrating to the United States was
The Chinese in 1882.
Yeah, it's kind of like America's sentimental towards the Chinese and China, but we really don't like when
our sentimentality is kind of flavored by a mix of market exploitation and racism, which kind of has we've not changed in 120 years, 140. But as soon as, and the irony about the open door policy too is like as soon as we push it, as soon as this thing is getting pushed by Hay and the rest of them, it's just that they're like, oh, well, this means jack shit in reference to the fact that the Boxers are rebelling, and that basically they think that the Chinese government's going to just fall apart, which is already, they have all the reason in the world to. We just witnessed a bloody civil war, and the fact that the English have been trying to press every political advantage they have. And they also just lost a war with Japan in the late 1890s. So everything points to the direction that China's imperial government is about to fall. And the Americans are looking at this thinking well, what the hell do we do? All of this comes out of the woodwork to more or less lead to this transnational, old world, new world intervention into China.
Right. And of course, the American idea of empire is very strange. It's largely being driven by these mugwump characters. A different Adams, not Henry Adams, but his brother, Charles Francis Jr., probably wrote the most at the time. And there's another guy, he's a European Jew that immigrated. Maybe it's Horace Greeley. No, I don't think he was. No, he wasn't. This is one of these Horace Greeley type characters, and the American justifications for imperialism, or if you're familiar with Sandbatchism at all, they sound very similar to this, which is that America is this is really the first time you start seeing the shining city on a hill, talking points emerge where America's justification for empire is, the white man's burden, and it's going to be America's specific ability to renew the Republican spirit of foreign peoples abroad, and that, the American industrial spirit will take hold in these countries and uplift all of humanity. And, we'll live in some sort of, again, utopian world. So American imperialism is, we've changed gears entirely from the 19th century isolationism. And these guys are it's actually America's duty to go forth and intervene in all of these international affairs on behalf of, the objective goodness that is the American soul.
But they're at least realistic enough to know to not push it too far, because as soon as this is 5 months after John Hay does this, months after the Boxer Rebellion's put down, the U.S. government is already negotiating with the Chinese to set up a naval port to get themselves situated to trade, and just a few short years after this, right, we get the Russo-Japanese War and the interest in Manchuria, and the Japanese are very adamant to press the Americans to help them fight in the spirit of this greater sort of Anglo-American interest, and also to have Manchuria be viewed as this Chinese-esque territory, which of course Japan has its own interest in. But at the same time, John Hay is very quick to call out them and say not at the present moment are we prepared to attempt to singularly or in concert with other powers enforce these views in the East by any demonstration which could present a clear act of hostility to any other power. America's still not in a position to exert itself on the old world, although I'd imagine in perhaps a alternate timeline, considering how the Sino-Japanese War, or not Sino, the Russo-Japanese War plays out in 1905, that they probably could have won. But again, we're meant for history at another time. But this is all at the same time when Kennan's giving these lectures. I think it's at the University of Chicago, where he's very adamant, lectures 2 and 3, which are about the open door and America's whole view on the East and the Orient, is that he just doesn't know enough to tell you anything other than to opine on what's already happened. And he's already spent 25 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. I mean, he was one of the first ones, and I think the class of 1926, we covered it in our Kennan series, is the first part of this modernized, less aristocratic, more, civic reform, centralized stuff that Colonel House was sort of spearheading during the Wilson administration, to have a more centralized diplomatic corps. And he's just like, I can only look back on the history of this and tell you that, like, these are the origins of America's, like, moral positions, our sentimentality about territorial integrity, but also because, certain key people that had various educational, political, and by nature of marriage played a role here. So this is where we're really seeing that aristocratic sentiment thrust itself on the world stage as a way on the basis of, like, the white man's burden, anti-yellow imperialism, and making America a quote unquote force for good in the world. And that's one of Kennan's, like, biggest takeaways about foreign policy. And I think it's also a larger critique that you can send about the foreign policy of democracies throughout history is that foreign policies of democracies always have to sell a warm fuzzy back to the electorate and back to their backers to sell themselves for whatever adventurism that they're about to take place. This is why with every administration, you will see time and time again that warm, fuzzy change from this, like, Revan-kissed George W. Bush, we're going to go get them a crusade for justice, to women's schools and education and gay rights. And even now, where Secretary of State Blinken's putting progress flags on every fucking embassy.
Right.
It all starts here.
Yeah, I mean, the real thing, interesting thing is going, because again, if you try and if you really try and drill down on what the open door policy is, it's actually pretty squishy. It's like, well, we're gonna defend China. We're gonna defend the interests of
the territorial integrity of China.
The territorial integrity of China, which in effect, if you're in London reading this, says we're going to preserve the anarcho-tyranny that
of Great Britain on China.
Yeah, that we're exerting on China, because as the world hegemon always favors free trade, always, and their challengers are the ones that are, for carving up spheres of influence and for protectionism, because essentially what they're doing is protecting against, the predatory economic behavior of the hegemon. And so that's ultimately that's really the position that America is wandering into here, is that these other old world great powers want to carve China up into little pieces that they can defend on paper as being formally theirs by agreement, and the British want to keep the libertarian wasteland going, because they're just by sheer force of numbers and mercant, especially in terms of shipping, the British are able to essentially quash anybody that they don't want. They can squeeze anybody out of this market that they want to, except maybe Russia. But they're interested in enlisting America to help them, to help them be able to continue to suppress Russia as well. And so this is with the open doors policy. We have this very strange relationship that is called the special relationship that exists between the United States and the United Kingdom. We're often referred to as as two kindred peoples separated by a common language. Like we profess a lot of the same general beliefs about the world, and they do in fact come from a similar sort of wellspring, but the British are way more realpolitik-y, and they're way more, I dare I say, conniving, and they're way more cynical than America.
Getting sort of very close to saying perfidious Albion.
Yeah, perfidious Albion. Yeah, I know. But the second thing that's really interesting with the open doors notes is because, like I said earlier, the State Department is really being thrust into it's under Roosevelt. They leap forward, they dive in head first under Roosevelt and Hay and a couple of these other characters, against the wishes of people like Henry Adams, who want to maintain the classic position of isolationism. But America finds itself as if you recall the graph, it's too big to really hide anymore. And so they find themselves having to engage in great power diplomacy, not just occasionally wade into it whenever something is threatening them. They can't be a wild card anymore. And if they're not going to be a wild card anymore, they have to develop something like a formal ideology, something like an actual, like, if not systemic policy, at least a set of talking points, at least a set of, widespread, behaviors that are going to be normalized in the course of this, this new progressive WASP American empire. What is the identity of this thing going to be? We're really remaking American identity all over again in this decade of the 1890s. We have the frontiers closing. All kinds of things are going on. And also, Kennan is interesting. Griswold and Kennan are interesting as well with respect to this, because this necessity to create an essentially a modern bureaucratic state, to at least a modern bureaucratic diplomatic corps, to be able to keep track of all of these little situations. Like you said, it's like you say in the message, Jesus H. Christ, we jumped the shark. We did, but it's very difficult. This is one of these points in world history where it becomes very difficult to collapse something down to a single narrative, because there are events all over the world that are affecting things all over the world, and they're popping off all the time. You need a lot of people to be able to keep track of this. And this, of course, spurs the creation of the modern American education system. Again, you mentioned Colonel House. Woodrow Wilson is himself a product of it. He's a history professor. He's a history professor first, and then a governor, and then a president. He's a very strong believer in sort of bureaucratic academic credentials. And so they start pumping these Ivy League schools full of money and full of talent. And, you start to see the emergence of the kind of modern technocratic state in that's birthed out of the necessity to create trained professionals that, for instance, they know German, they can speak Chinese, they can monitor the situation, they can have people on the ground in the American embassies instead of just having, a part-time ambassador who has drinks with the other ambassadors occasionally. This is now a full-time job. And so Kennan is, himself, he's a product of one of the very early products of this. And it's interesting in this lecture that, looking back on this 25 years later, he has the prescience to say, it's too messy to really be able to draw a conclusive lesson from, that really the lesson of the open door policy in a lot of ways is that it becomes very difficult to draw lessons.
Well, he was alive for all the debates that emerged in it. I mean,
right.
I'm glad that you had mentioned that. I did say we jumped the shark not because you were talking too long or anything like that, but because this is a complex question. Because the open door policy, if you were to look up the open door policy on YouTube right now and you don't watch this video, all that you're going to find are a bunch of AP US history prep videos that are telling you that America's really concerned about access to trade, and they're really only concerned about their holdings in Guam and the Philippines, when that is such a minute factor in the comparison of the fact that the United States is beginning to slowly play ball in the greater geopolitical world of the old powers. And the fact what immediately comes afterwards is that America is brutally unprepared to deal with the policy of the Orient. And that's why Kennan points out in these lectures that really our entire foreign policy has been colored, and it is still colored to this day, because our first real venture out there is in two forms. It's our gunboat diplomacy with Japan, and secondly, but most importantly, it's our policy towards China, and it's the open door that does so. And what's happening, of course, during Kennan's time in foreign service is that you have everyone debating this. I was in prepping for this lecture because I asked Sandbatch to come on. The Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, July 1933, volume 168, American Policy in the Pacific. This guy named Tyler Dennett tries his best to explain that really what this is that the open door policy is that all that we're doing here is intervention. And all of this comes back to the debate over the Monroe Doctrine, which we covered a few months back or several months back with Sandbatch again, because it's these long, delectable pieces of history, which illustrates how complex it is. And here Denon is arguing this open door policy is an intervention for several reasons. And he argues one of them is the British influence on American government, the position that America has as the integrity of China, only for the sole fact that the English are interested in it. And the American government was very concerned about whether or not it would actually use military force to do so. Because he writes to the Secretary of State, John Hay, this is what McKinley writes, and he's very concerned. And he says, the inherent weakness of our position is this. We do not want to rob China ourselves, and our public opinion will not permit us to interfere with an army to prevent others from robbing her. Besides, we have no army. The talk of the papers about our preeminent moral position giving us the authority to dictate to the world is mere flapdoodle. That's President McKinley writing, you know?
Yeah, he's a real conservative. That's that's another one of these fascinating conundrums. Okay, you can call Teddy Roosevelt a lot of things, but he's not a conservative by any means. Okay, and the way this guy comes to power by literally backstabbing people until he's vice president under this. McKinley's kind of this old tottering dude. He's he's very much like a late 19th century Joe Biden. He's old. He doesn't have much of a conviction one way or the other about anything. He's elected primarily on the basis of his willingness to go out and represent the interests of the gold holders. Okay, kind of like Joe Biden's been called for years he was referred to as the senator from Visa. It's a very similar situation going on. McKinley doesn't have a lot of conviction about anything. He's kind of this waffling old man that gets pushed into, but every once in a while, he will lodge a complaint letter because he's got this very strong sense that his underlings are scheming around him to get him involved in something that he's unprepared to handle. And of course, he's absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, and this is why, like, the debate over silver, gold, and imperialism, these are the things that will, like, taint and stain American domestic politics for the next century. Even I'm tainted by it in my own politics because I tell people to read the People's Pottage all the bloody time. And what is Garrett influenced by? Well, he's already an old man when he's writing The Revolution Was, Ex-America, and the Rise of Empire in the 1950s. He's near the end of his life. And what was he alive to witness? He was alive to witness not only like FDR and the reforms that came with that, but he's also alive to witness the debates over the issues of silver, gold, and the idea of imperialism. And he's very adamantly against this. So, like, when you hear about this, like, quote unquote, like, some say it's a slur, some others would say it's their position about non-interventionism. It is all coming back to the 1890s. The debates over foreign policy in the 1890s are going to, like, be the mainstay of American domestic political politics, even to this day. Where we still tell political mythos of ourselves about, like, say, George W. Bush's campaign positions in the 2000 election, because people will say all the time that he's like, oh, he really campaigned against nation building when he's advocating for an open door policy of the United States. He campaigned on internationalism. And these things are still to this day. These things still shape American politics and foreign policy to this day, 140 years later.
I mean, I'll use it over and over again. You can iterate this because, again, there's the thing with the ships. Okay, so like we intervened in the Spanish-American War. Oh, somebody blew up the USS Maine. Nobody blew up the USS Maine. This is the first time America plays the card that it plays over and over and over again to get involved in these wars. Something happened to one of our ships. You blew up our battleships in Pearl Harbor. Never mind that they were the old battleships. You blew up our battleships in Pearl Harbor. Okay, oh, you shot at our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Just over and over again. This is the card that we play if we're going to get involved. We have essentially been running the script of 1895 to 1898, the Spanish-American War and the Open Doors Notes, over and over and over again. It's what Carl Schmitt would call a political script. First and only time I will ever cite Carl Schmitt on anything,
and a positive lens too, mind you.
Right. But yeah, the historiography of it is also interesting because, again, I'm familiar with it through Griswold, and Griswold is kind of famous as one of the founders of the Yale IR School, and the IR School is going to tend to emphasize sort of Aristotelian cooperation and sort of high-minded idealism. So the IR School is famous for taking America's bullshit seriously. And this is one of the things that Griswold gets kind of, he gets kind of slapped for a couple of times, especially in later historiography on this topic. which is and I guess the major historiographical inflection points. There's Griswold first, and then there's in I guess the Kennan lectures, probably because it did make a splash. That is okay. So there's the Griswold. America really is trying to, it's got its strategic interests, of course, and it is interested in cooperating with Great Britain. But it is essentially acting altruistically in its goal to protect the sovereignty of the people of China. And he believes that both China and the United States eventually advantage themselves from this arrangement, and everything kind of works out. Okay. Kennan is going to be a little bit more cynical, and he's actually, in some ways, I don't think he's cynical enough, but, he actually, in his lecture, he actually accuses us of kind of undercutting the British. See, this is one of the things I don't really agree with on him, is I think he kind of, posits the possibility that we're using Great Britain to further our own interests. And I think this is where him being a product of that education system and maybe the Hayes school of thought, I think kind of clouds his judgment a little bit, because he's kind of still in awe of these people. Okay. And I don't think they're as sophisticated. I think they were sort of getting played by the Chamberlains and the Paunceforts and the Salisburys of the world. And then there's another inflection point.
I would argue that Kennan isn't making the point so much as that we're trying to undercut the British deliberately, but he's highlighting the fact that America has to use these existing powers and entangling alliances in order to make up for the fact that America as a power doesn't have any position to do so. I mean, Kennan makes it very clear. He says that, neither the phrases open door or administrative and territorial integrity of China have any clear applicability to the actual situations in China, in the sense that they could have been anything to indicate feasible and practical alternatives to all the special positions and interests of the powers, meaning Germany, Russia, the UK, have in that country. It was not that the principles were wrong, it's just that they had no elements of soundness or truth, that justice was possible at all from the American side. He's calling out the fact that we're having to rely on these other powers and the politics of them. And I think that Kennan, looking at the more modern system and looking at the past of his forebears, people like, Philander Knox or the John Hayes of the world, he's looking at them realizing, my entire career is built off of these guys' mess.
Right. But we can push this even further back, all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, we did the Monroe Doctrine thing, and I told you, the Monroe Doctrine, as it comes down to us, is actually John Quincy Adams is like, holy shit, we've started something now, we've got to finish it, we've got to walk this back somehow. Where he has this moment where he goes into James Monroe's office, and Monroe and Calhoun are in there, scheming about starting a war with Austria and Russia. The whole U.S. Army is like 2 divisions. It's like what are you doing? It's like, again, that's that bit you just quoted from Kennan. It's okay, it's all great, but why? Why here? Why now? What did you think you were getting into? Oh man, it's funny. That's really, and the next major turn in the historiography is this character. He's very associated with the New Left, but because I have a soft spot for the New Left in a way that everyone does, but only I admit. He's a character by the name of William Appleman Williams, who wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, where he points out that America has always had this very high-minded, idealistic vision of itself, but at several major turns in America's existence, it has deliberately chosen to do exactly the opposite of kind of and he's got a very cynical interpretation of Open Door, where he thinks it's a naked power play on behalf of the American oligarchical class. And that has kind of been that interpretation. William Appleman Williams, his reputation has kind of been overshadowed recently, because he's a white dude. So he has to go. But he got, some passages from his book, again, Tragedy of American Diplomacy.
Where he gets that, though, right? He gets that from Dennett. the guy I just
Yeah.
cited earlier, because he's not
Yeah.
only John Hay's biographer, but he's the guy that wrote the book on Americans in East Asia and the Roosevelt and the Russo-Japanese War in the 1920s. Like, he's the proto guy. Because here's where I think he's going to get it from. He's like, because this is where he's talking about the fact that the words open door policy have changed through 4 different administrations at the time that he's writing this. And he makes the point there. He's like, I merely ask, therefore, that whichever be the choice, that you do not confuse the categories, the policy of the open door, of the integrity of China, and its newer cousin, the non-recognition of any situation, treaty, or agreement which may be brought about means contrary to the covenant obligations of the Pact of Paris. While apparently the pacific and humanitarian is the Sermon on the Mount, as are the Sermon on the Mountain, are in fact no more so than the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, for both which much blood had to be spilled. If, on the other hand, you support the Stimson policy because it seems calculated to serve American material interests in the Far East, do not forget that in 1898 to 1902, we played for a much bigger stake than now. The open door and integrity of China doctrines were more in the nature of slogans than of moneymakers. They never have yet made any Americans millionaires, though they have made many American bankrupt and paupers. But we did win something, the paramount position of the United States in the Caribbean. What comparable actual material interest may we expect to win today?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot going on in there. Again, we have this again. The win. What do we win in the open door policy in China? We win the Caribbean. Okay. Again, that's on the other side of the world. We haven't even talked about the Caribbean. But that is that's the only real win. He talks in there about this China trade. Like, look, think about the graph. Look where that China line is. It's way down there. There's no indication that these people are, there's no indication that these people are going to buy American goods. There's no indication they're going to do anything like that. Like, this is all made up. And then there's this question, is the open door policy even a policy? It has the reason the British have figured into this so strongly is because the open door policy doesn't acquire any sort of actual backbone or any ability to be enforced, or even
and it keeps everyone off their main moneymaker, which is India,
right? Until the British endorse it, which they which they do slowly, and then they snap on it. It's like catching a big fish, but there's no actual policy here. It's just a vague statement of principles, and then we just kind of play it by ear. It means whatever we need it to mean at the time. Very similar, to the Monroe Doctrine, which just whatever the Monroe Doctrine was originally. Again, it's the Roosevelt corollary, or the Johnson corollary, or
this is why I wish we kind of did act on the James K. Polk thing of like just defend white colonizers, but that didn't happen for obvious reasons, because that was the 1840s and things were already getting bloody at home. But I mean, this goes back to Kennan's cynicism, because he's looking at this, and Kennan's no idiot. I mean, people will a lot of biographers will say that Kennan doesn't know America, but he knows Russia, which I get it, right? He's a big Anton Chekhov and Pushkin fan, and he loves Tolstoy, and he would cite Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire ad nauseum when he was a younger diplomat trying to impress the Secretary of State. But he does know America because he knows its history as well as he knows Russian history. And Kennan is looking at his forebears, the guys that literally came in a generation before him. And he's also looking at the Monroe Doctrine, and he's like, holy shit, everything that America's diplomatic policy has been, this is why the open door policy, he spends 2 lectures on it, lectures 2 and 3. He spends so much time on it because he's implicating the fact that America's diplomacy and its foreign policy so far at the time, since the turn of the century for him, right, so 50 years, has been primarily oriented around these warm fuzzies. And what are those warm fuzzies? Humanitarianism, or we have to sell something back home. And no actual long-standing policy position of what is America's actual interest in China, when instead we're reactive. We're going to get involved in China because we're really interested in the Caribbean. Or at the same time, right, we're involved in Ukraine, and because of the second order impacts of Ukraine, this allows us to up our ante with the Chinese and say semiconductor production. Not much has changed, and I kind of understand Kennan's cynicism today is held up incredibly well, because we have not changed in 140 years. We haven't.
Well, one important thing has changed, which is that in especially in the mid 20th century. When I say mid 20th century, I mean like, 1920 to 1940 or so. And Kennan's a product of this. We actually produced incredible scholars. We produced an incredibly so if you're going to do this warm fuzzies fly by the seat of your pants thing, do you want to
have smart people running it?
Do you want to do it with Henry Stimson, or do you want to do it with Anthony Blinken? Take your pick.
And there was a tweet, I don't know if you saw it, by a friend of mine, Martin, and he had made reference to the fact that, people can shit on Hannah Arendt all that they want. I think some of
that was a great tweet.
It was a great tweet.
That was a great tweet.
His point was that Hannah Arendt could recite Homer in Greek by age 14 and studied other languages well before she was 25. And she's way smarter than any caliber of elites that we have today. I mean,
right. I mean, even today, our high IQ people, when they started to debate with one another, the first thing is they pull up Chat GPT. Both of them independently pull up Chat GPT, ask it the same question, and they let the probabilistic model dictate what their position is, and they argue back and forth with one another about that. Oh wow, that's terrifying. That's where we're going. This fly by the seat of your pants thing, it's not working as well, because, and this is a great book I read. It was called The Decline and Fall. Splendors and Miseries of an American Aristocracy, and it's all about the failures of the WASP, and the failure of the open. I mean, the Open Door Society is very much a story of the rise and fall of this class of people, the WASPs, because they are at the instant whenever they're making up essentially what the modern, ideology, national identity of America is. They're kind of at the peak of their power, and they have this concept of that's it. That's a savage book too. I mean, it's a lot to be said about it, but he makes this point that this utopian world where the smartest and the best and the brightest, they get together and they don't necessarily have an ideological plan. They have and they form a consensus. The great captains of industry and the public servants, based on their liberal arts learning, gained from, Dr. Eliot and, Dr. Santayana, they're going to get together and they're going to discuss what the best course of action for America in this given, in this boutique given situation is. How it worked for a while and really peaks around the time of the Roosevelt administration. I mean, again, I'm the only guy in the world that'll, I'm FDR's top guy. But it kind of peaks in the Roosevelt administration. And then after that, it slowly starts to sink into, arguably through, ethnic diffusion, the whatever happens, the message gets watered down, and this utopian world predicted by the WASPs that they attempted to build does not materialize. But in many cases, the policies remain. The general scatterbrain, absent-minded professor, attitude towards governing the largest empire in the history of the world remains. And, a lot of times I think what gets interpreted as American evil, or, it's just really a symptom of we actually don't have a plan in a lot of cases. Or in other cases, we have inherited a plan from the British, our entire Middle East entanglement. Again, this is something we inherit it from the British. Largely as a result of this Anglo-American rapprochement that occurs around the time of the Open Doors. So whenever we look at the Open Door period, the Open Door policy, the debates surrounding it, the geopolitical context that it occurs in, we're looking at the birth of America in the sense that we recognize it. Dan Carlin had a great line about this in his podcast about the emergence of the American empire, where he points out, if you talk to Henry Adams or somebody like that, Henry Adams, he dies in 1917, but he calls himself an 18th century man because he grew up in the house of John Quincy Adams, a man who was born in the 18th century, and his early memories were of an America that was still roundly Puritan. These titans of the American Revolution, in some cases, are still around. And the world he lives in is totally different from the one that whenever he leaves Britain in 1901 and passes out, because he was the American ambassador to the UK as well. He passes this job off to somebody else and says, "I don't understand the world anymore. I'm gone. See you later." And then he goes off to France, and he's there for the start of World War I, and then he comes back to America and dies. But the people from before, so Henry Adams's generation and before, we don't have much in common with them. We have to try very, very hard to contextualize the world that they live in. But from the Open Door Notes on, and from the Roosevelt Corollary on, and from the world that we live in starts to take shape. We can kind of recognize the issues that are going to arise for these people. We can recognize their motivation. We can see the shadow of the elite managerial technocratic regime that we all love and that we all know and love so well. We can see it starting to really take shape here. A lot of people will try and put that location, like Yarvin will try and put that, locate that beginning much earlier in the ultra Calvinist thesis or something like that. Or a lot of people will try and place it around the Civil War, but no, it's right here is when it happens. It's this wrangling over the emergence of an American empire, what that's going to look like, and how it's going to conduct itself. That's it's kind of the take home message here. That was a lot of talking again. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I mean, you've echoed much of my sentiment as well on this, and I mean, this is why Kennan is a personal hero of mine, because Kennan is looking back at the guys that came right before him, a generation that he is not familiar with, a class of people that he's not familiar with. Everyone forgets that, we've turned George F. Kennan into this, I think rightfully, this lion of American foreign policy and everything like that. But everyone needs to remember, this guy's born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1904. He is not of this WASP class. Yes, he goes to Princeton University and he becomes a well-respected scholar, but he's unaccustomed to the elite atmosphere of the Ivy League. He has no idea what he's in for.
He's like F. Scott Fitzgerald. Okay, F. Scott Fitzgerald's from he's from St. Paul, Minnesota. Wisconsin again. Brad Kelly that does the
Art of Darkness podcast.
The Art of Darkness pod. Yeah, he told me, because Great Gatsby is probably one of my favorite books ever. Okay, and Great Gatsby is, of course, it's about Western. It's about these Western people. Nick Carraway he's a Midwesterner. Gatsby is from North Dakota. Okay, and they go east and they enter this world of the old WASPs. Okay, and they're rubes in it for the most part. They're kind of strung along in these
Big Trouble and Little Wasp.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And this is what Brad said. He said, and I had never thought about this before. He said, in order to understand the Great Gatsby, you have to have been to North Dakota. And because that's where Gatsby's from. And I thought, that was one of the most brilliant things. Everybody's listening. Y'all should go check that podcast out. That's one of my favorites right now. But yeah, no, that's what it is. These guys, Kennan, he's another one of these guys. He's a Westerner that's kind of arrived on the scene through, these talent search programs that, the American government has started to run, where, we've started to realize that we have this whole, interior country, and that American golden age, that intellectual American golden age that, talked about a little while ago. It's largely driven by this need to actually comb the country and find talent. And for about 20 or 30 years, we were very good at it. We created a lot of opportunity for very high IQ people from a lot of BF Egypt type places, and we don't do that anymore. And that's another one of the reasons why, our dog and pony show of an empire is not working as well, because we're, we've cut off our talent. In a lot of ways, we've severed our talent artery. That there aren't any George Kennans coming. The latter day George Kennan is doing a podcast with a frog avatar.
I mean, that's kind of you to word it that way. But isn't that the case? I think, and I guess we're gonna maybe this would be a good place to have closing remarks, though. As I mean, like this is where the American empire, as we know it, formulates. And I had teased earlier. I mean, like imperialism, as it's defined nowadays, is so based upon the English economist John Atkinson Hobson and his theory of imperialism being a big part of Lenin's concept of underconsumption, and we can talk about that later, but for another time, because I want to write an essay on that. And what irks me is that has become more or less the definite understanding of imperialism is Hobson's, about more or less the search for new markets and new investment opportunities, that it's not nationalism or morals here. Whereas, America, at least at the time of the open door policy, because if there's one big takeaway out of this entire discussion, is that it's not so much the market interest that you're going to hear from an AP US history video that's like 3.5 minutes long explaining the open door policy, if they even teach it at all in public schools anymore. But instead, really what this is that America is espousing itself upon the world stage, and it's realizing, oh shit, this is a little different than the shining city on the hill that doesn't get involved with the old world anymore. And where Kennan comes out of this is that Kennan is now living in a world where you have to play the game of markets, where you have to play the game of realpolitik. And he's looking at his forebears that are trying to figure it out, and he realizes that they don't. And what they do is fly by the seat of their pants, because they're trying to espouse values at home. And that's where you get that democratic critique of, or the critique of democracies and foreign policies, is that you have to sell the warm fuzzy at home because you need a political formula to sell it. And so America gets this high-minded notion about its ideas, and we still sell it to ourselves these days. And Kennan's really cynical about it, because he's like, the more we keep doing this, the more we're going to be brutally unprepared for like the next great game. And he's looking at it in the context, of course, of the Soviet Union. And he knows Russia. And he lives to see Russia fall, mind. He dies in like 2004. He lives to be like 100-something years old. He lives to see a lot. And he even argued against NATO expansion. But Kennan is like witnessing this world transition for America specifically, like you're talking about with Henry Adams, this high-minded idealism of what America is. And he's recognizing that like the stuff that we got ourselves into is not prepared at all for the world that is existing right now and the world that is to come. And I think to this day, it's going to be a problem that we still exist here, because this diversity, equity, and inclusion bullshit in foreign policy is a great way to sell to your like newly diversified, imperial heartland that you keep flooding in with more people to turn your country into an economic zone. But it doesn't really do so well if you want long-standing policy that would keep your country afloat and around for the next century. And that's the real big. And again, it has its inception, like we said, it has its inception here in the late 1890s about, well, what the fuck's America going to do with China? And we're still asking questions what America's going to do with China.
Yeah, we still don't know what to do with China. Yeah.
Although we seem to be planning for war with them, which is even more terrifying.
Yeah, you're like, it's terrifying, and I'm like, crush them.
Well, we can. If you want to crush them, we should just like leave them alone and let them, let the live leak videos keep pouring in on construction sites. But
good Lord, yeah.
I'm not an advocate like our friend Sunflower Society. I'm not in the PJ O'Rourke give war a chance crowd, because I don't think this country is remotely prepared for it. And call me pessimistic, but I like living.
Yeah, no, same. Did we do an intro?
No, I will have. Well, this will be a premiere, so I'll have the intro edited in post. Yeah. But Mr. Sandbatch, we've been on now for almost 2 hours. Is there anything that you would like to let your the listeners know about what you do? You're finally writing again, which I'm very happy about.
Yeah, it should actually have one. Well, it's going to publish tomorrow, so it's going to be live for the same day. I'm actually talking because Nick Land has been. I always plug. We used to have anything you want to plug? Do you want to tell us to read your blog? And I'm like, go read Nick Land. Nick Land has been doing great stuff. Tomorrow I've got an essay that's coming out about this Roald Dahl stuff, and I think you talked about it recently with.
Yeah, I did with Oren.
And yeah, so I'm gonna wade into that one, because I always wait until the the hot take economy has moved on before I
Oof.
before I bother to say anything. And well, no, you're definitely well outside the hot take economy on this one. Well, that issue's like 2 weeks old. We got GPT-4 now, but yeah, really go follow me on Twitter, even if you don't want to, just because I want clout now. At the age of 33, I've decided I want clout. So go follow me on Twitter. And
How
if you want,
Christ-like of you.
yeah, I could do worse than that. Did you hear what I said? The like at 33, the age Jesus Christ's career ended and Thomas Jefferson started. It's the most awful thing I've ever said.
Almost blasphemy.
Almost.
Pretty sure that is.
Yeah, this is well over the line. But then, yeah, I also write Esoterica Americana, which it's just my blog. I used to make fun of it by saying it's my blog that I don't write on. But now that I write on it, I have to come up with a different joke about it. My new joke about it is that it's a blog called Esoterica Americana, but I almost never write about America. So whatever.
That's when you come on here to rant for 90 minutes about Esoterica Americana.
Right, exactly. Well, we just ran through like 3 drafts that I have that I just never got around to publishing. So like, I can go delete those now. But yeah, Esoterica Americana is the stack, and I think I'm at Sandbatch on Twitter. Yeah. You'll probably see me around.
Your links will be down below in the description.
Oh, right. I forgot about that. I used to not have links I used to just come on these things. When I first started going on shows, it was 10 years ago now. I used to refer to myself as the Warren Zevon of the right wing. It's like, so if your guest cancels for the night, if Paul Schaefer can't make it tonight, you call Warren Zevon and he comes on and he's the musical guest for the evening. And I really started because I face doxed recently on Twitter, and a bunch of people told me I look like Warren Zevon, and I was like, it's real strange continuity.
I don't see it, but
I don't either. People tell me I look like Dennis Quaid too, and I don't see that at all. I'm like, what?
I don't know. I'm looking that one up. I don't see it either.
Yeah, that's like that one, but it's like women frequently, like a lot of them, like 5 women over the last 10 years have told me, like, you look like Dennis Quaid, and I'm like, I guess we just look at the world differently. But yeah, again, see Sandbatch on Twitter and Esoterica Americana on Substack.
Sounds great. Well, I will let you all. Actually, I'm just going to do announcements now because I don't actually have too much to announce in regards to all that jazz. But I will be relatively light on future appearances as for right now. I've done like 3 or 4 in the last 2 weeks. I've done 4 in the last 2 weeks. I was on Unpopular Opinions. I was on Jay Burden Show. I was on Anthony of Westgate's podcast called The Reversion, which I've linked in the community tab, as well as on Substack with a cross post. And then, I was on Oren McIntyre earlier this week. And then this week, the Digital Archipelago will be on my channel. And Sandbatch will get a kick out of this. But we will be covering 3 Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan movies that are my guilty pleasure. So we're reviewing.
Is one of them You've Got Mail?
Yeah, we're reviewing You've Got Mail, Sleepless in Seattle, and Joe versus the Volcano.
Yeah.
You've Got Mail is a very dirty, guilty pleasure of mine.
That's a great movie. It's actually one of my favorites. It's it's like, because again, as a peak millennial, I am not as tech skeptical as some people are, and I still tend to live in that world where your strange entanglements on the internet can have positive real world outcomes. And there's a strong dividing line right around the year 2013, where people who came of age after that are incredibly cynical about the possibility of the internet. And You've Got Mail is one of those beautiful sort of relics of that
zeitgeist of techno optimism.
A much more optimistic world than the one we live in now.
Well, I've changed a lot of my. Well, I'm trying to change my position, because normally I'm skeptical, and my gut reaction is to tell people why I'm not going to buy a computer by Wendell Berry. But I'm beginning to slowly embrace a nuanced form of techno optimism, which is you need to build your own weapons to survive the I guess Landian machine war that is inevitable to come.
Accelerate.
I take the Vogelin stance of don't immanentize the eschaton, but if we have to,
Is that who that comes from?
Vogelin,
That's
yeah.
I think
He's also like the OG guy to call everything Gnostic, which is a big problem.
I know about the Gnostic thing, because I went to LSU and that's where Eric Vogelin taught. And the Eric Vogelin Institute is still there, and so that fascinates me that Eric Vogelin is a national figure, because I just always think of as like, oh, that's the dude who's like that's the dude whose research center we used to get free donuts at if we went to Dr. Stoner's lectures.
What's funny though is that like it comes from Vogelin, but everyone associates don't immanentize the eschaton with William F. Buckley. And it just makes me hate him more.
Dave the Distributist is like, because I thought that was a Dave the Distributist original.
No, that's an Eric Vogelin Catholic original.
Yeah, well, they're both Catholic.
Yeah, so it all works out. Anyways, Dave, if you're listening, we love you, but not that he does. But all right, well, I think I'll wrap it up here, and we will see you all live next Saturday, where we will be covering lecture number 4 of American Diplomacy, World War I. Hopefully, I should have a longer Substack essay out on the discussion of imperialism. It'll be kind of like a lit review mixed with some hot takes of the day. But all right, we'll see you guys next time. Take care.